Welcome back. Trying to understand the origin and nature of severe mental health conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar is a problem psychiatry and neuroscience is still very much struggling with, and a problem I definitely faced in my clinical experience. My guest today is a prolific researcher and the author of several books on this topic, such as Doctoring the Mind, Why Psychiatric Treatments Fail, and Madness Explained. Although some people have labeled him as aligned with the so-called anti-psychiatry movement, my experience was that I was speaking to someone who was and is heavily involved and invested in the research in this area, not dismissive of the potential biological processes at play, and someone who was not anti-diagnosis as such, but who wanted our diagnoses to be better, more sophisticated, and more reflective of an underlying biopsychosocial reality. Today I'm in conversation with Professor Richard Bentall, a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Sheffield. His research has focused on the psychological mechanisms of severe mental illness, like hallucinations and delusions, and social factors that affect the development of these conditions. His work, along with the work of other researchers, is responsible for psychological interventions such as cognitive behaviour therapy, being included in the National Guidance for the Treatment of Psychotic Type Conditions. Benthall, along with some collaborators, also published a meta-analysis in 2012, suggesting strongly that psychological trauma confers a highly consistent risk towards developing psychosis as an adult. Today we discuss what are the symptoms in detail which characterize psychotic episodes and manic episodes and the way they overlap, some of the problems with our diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or schizoaffective disorder, the role of psychiatric genetics and statistics in beginning to help us understand more deeply the origin and nature of these conditions, the role of the environment and trauma and how these conditions develop, psychological mechanisms underlying things like hallucinations and delusions, the 5 kinds of delusions that present themselves most commonly all around the world, how people with severe mental illness can be approached psychologically, and how the design of mental health systems could be influenced by different key examples from around the world. This is the Thinking Mind Podcast, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, and self-development. As always, thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, check out the links in the description. And now here's today's conversation with Professor Richard Bentall. Professor Richard Bentall, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's nice to be here.
We're going to discuss a few interesting topics today. Actually, earlier today, I had a conversation with Dr. Mark Horowitz criticizing the biomedical model of depression and perhaps some of the limitations and dangers of antidepressants. Today, we're going to be talking more about conditions like psychosis and bipolar, and I'm curious to see what differences may arise between talking about psychosis and bipolar and depression. Again, limitations of the biomedical model, and perhaps some questions about how we should be rethinking our public mental health system. But first, it'd be great to know a little bit about your story, how you got involved with studying the things that you did and where that journey took you.
I guess the first thing to say is that I'm at probably the opposite end of my career than you're at. So I've been around for a long time. That said, I don't plan to stop in any time soon because I really enjoy what I do. I qualified as a clinical psychologist in 1983, having previously done a PhD in experimental psychology at Bangor University. And my PhD didn't have anything to do with clinical psychology directly. It was actually in, as I say, experimental psychology applied to child development, actually. Although I'd originally hoped that it would have a focus on mental illness. So I'd actually spent about 6 months visiting daily almost a big psychiatric hospital of the old kind, Denbigh Hospital in North Wales. And it was just winding down. I think it had about 1,000 patients when I was there, but it was rapidly emptying. But I don't know why, but I was fascinated by schizophrenia. I'd read Lang, actually, as a student, which helped. And I did a little research project as part of my clinical training, which was on hallucinations, actually. after I qualified, I worked for 2 years in NHS forensic services, where most of the patients were psychotic. And I had no idea what I was doing. I think it was psychiatrists who were very much in control at the time. They thought I was nice but useless. There's this nice young man called Richard Bentall who wants to work with people with psychosis. We don't think he can do any harm. Let's let him do it. But at the time, it was just at the time when people were beginning to think about maybe whether psychological therapies could be applied to psychosis. And for some reason, it was something about the culture, but other people throughout in the country were also interested, particularly down in your neck of the woods, in Slam King's, what's King's College now. But so people like Philippa Geraghty, for example, Liz Kuipers, and David Fowler. And we formed a kind of loose network and we just found our way, I think. And eventually that led to clinical trials of CBT for psychosis. And eventually that led to CBT being recognized by NICE as a treatment for people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. I was always very fascinated in the phenomenon themselves. Why is it that people hear voices? What's going on when people hear voices? And I had a particular idea about voices, which I still think is probably mostly true, which is that they are a form of inner speech. When I was doing my PhD studying children, I was interested in inner speech, this whole process by which we learn to talk to ourselves in our heads, which is a normal part of child development. So when I was doing my clinical training, a natural kind of thought was, surely hallucinations must be something going wrong with inner speech. So that's how I started on that. But over years, I've been involved in a lot of different aspects of psychosis. I've been involved in, mainly I focused on studies to try and understand the psychological mechanisms, but they broaden out to include, for example, neuroimaging a little bit, although I don't really know how to turn on the MRI scanner, so somebody else has to do that bit. I've been involved in psychiatric epidemiology. I'm a bit of a kind of, I like all types of methodologies, actually. I've done qualitative research as well, and clinical trials, as I mentioned before. And one of the things which has emerged out of that is the discovery that trauma in the history of patients with appears to be quite important, and I would say a causal factor. Not the only causal factor, but a causal factor in psychosis. And that was an idea which even about 15 years ago was heavily resisted by a lot of mental health professionals, but I think it's now pretty much widely accepted.
Yeah, I think I started training very much in the era where it was just about being accepted into the mainstream, more or less. But taking a step back just for a moment, what do you think is a useful working definition of psychosis?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. So by psychosis, clinical psychologists these days and quite a lot of psychiatrists prefer the term psychosis precisely because it doesn't give, I think, a sort of air of a kind of diagnostic precision, which isn't really merited in this area. So psychotic disorders I think of as disorders in which there is, in some sense, the individual appears to lose touch with reality. Typically, the diagnoses which people receive in this area are schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, or schizoaffective disorder sometimes, delusional disorder sometimes. But as I think you probably know, I've always been skeptical about the scientific and actually clinical value, utility of those kind of diagnoses. They don't really cleave nature of its joints. And I've been involved in quite a lot of research which actually shows that. Actually.
What do you mean by that?
Ideally, we'd want to classify. So I actually, just taking a step back, I should first of all say I'm not against classification. Classification is an essential kind of part of science. Any science makes progress only when it's got a kind of working classification system. So Linnaean classification of the species led ultimately to Darwin's theory of evolution. Mendeleev's classification of the periodic table, of chemicals in the periodic table, led to an understanding of the atomic structure of elements. So we do have to have a classification system. And ideally, we want classification to, I can't remember whose phrase it was, that cleave nature of its joints, but basically we want to actually have it corresponding to reality. And ideally, that if it's a categorical classification, it should, each diagnostic label or species description or whatever should actually identify a naturally occurring kind of entity or individual. And for a long time, psychiatry and to some extent clinical psychology labored under the idea that the kind of diagnosis we find in the DSM system do cleave nature to its joints. So that schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are completely separate conditions, for example. But there's a mountain of evidence which suggests that's not true, of all sorts of different sorts. We mentioned just a minute ago that trauma being a causal factor, heavily implicated in both bipolar disorder and actually major depression and schizophrenia. It's actually a sort of basically linked to just about every poor mental health outcome. If we look at genes, nobody's found specific genes for schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. There are genetic effects, but they're not diagnostically specific ones.
But it's worth maybe pointing out that there seems to be a lot of heritability in those conditions, in that, for example, taking psychosis as an example, if one person, with twins separated at birth, one twin develops psychosis at some point in their lives, the other twin is, in my understanding, has a 50% likelihood of developing psychosis. Is that correct?
Okay, I'm going to challenge that. Okay, I'll challenge it on 2 points. The first one is just a numbers one. There are 2 ways of calculating what we call concordance rates in those kind of studies, which is the extent to which you get similarity between the 2 twins. Yeah, one's called the program-wise method and one's called the pair-wise method. Without going to the maths, which would be a tedious discussion, geneticists tend to prefer the program-wise method, which gives higher numbers. I prefer the pairwise, and it's not because I'm against genetics, just because it makes more sense to me. So the pairwise concordance rate is 25%. So roughly speaking, somewhere in that region, 20 to 25%. So if you have schizophrenia and you have an identical twin, then that identical twin has a 25% chance of.
Which is still significant, given that the baseline rate in the population is 1%.
It is much higher than in the general population. So there is a genetic effect. I don't think there's any doubt about it.
Okay.
But also, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding about the nature of that effect. So I've become very fascinated with psychiatric genetics in recent years, and I've been trying to get funding to do some research of my own, but it's been quite difficult. But anyway, people think of heritability as basically a causation index. And you often see that actually written in textbooks, for example. So it said, there was a meta-analysis which said that by Sullivan, which is actually quite old, but the most recent, which claims that the heritability of schizophrenia is 83%. If you think that means that 83% of the cause is genetic, then you think, wow, this is something which is almost entirely genetic. But it doesn't mean that. And the reason for that is because technically a heritability coefficient is actually a correlation coefficient. And it's just a correlation. It's a partial correlation coefficient, to be precise. So what it's talking about is the correlation between the whole genome, basically, and the person's risk of disease. Anybody who's done a stats course knows what they're taught on day one about correlations. They don't necessarily apply causality. So the pathway, the causal mechanisms which go from genes to psychosis are potentially very complicated. And the weird thing is geneticists just don't seem to understand this, or most don't. Believe me, I've had lots of discussions with them about it. Including once giving a talk about OS to a genetics conference, which was quite memorable. I started my talk when I talked to them by saying at the conference, where I said, I think I've probably been invited here to annoy you. And at the end, somebody stood up and said, you have succeeded.
So what do the geneticists think then?
The essential point, let me just give you a concrete example. Okay. When you get down to the DNA level, there are basically 2 types of genetic variations which appear to be linked to severe mental illness. One type is called common variant, and these are hundreds of tiny genetic variations which produce each a very tiny increase of risk. So putting those to aside for 1 minute, and I could talk about those if you like, but what a lot of geneticists got more excited about is what are called deletions. And this is when, due to various accidental processes, that whole chunks of DNA get eliminated or duplicated. Actually, they're called copy number variations, because sometimes you get more than one copy of a whole chunk of DNA. And there is something called DiGiorgio syndrome, which is linked to, I think it's a big deletion on the 11th chromosome, if memory serves me well. And this has a very high risk of psychosis. So somebody with DiGiorgio syndrome, initial studies seem to indicate that the increased risk might be as much as 8 or 12 times. It's not as high as that in recent studies, but it's still quite substantial, yeah? Bigger than any other genetic variation which has ever been found. So why is this? The temptation is to go, there's something about chromosome 11 which actually causes psychosis. But if you look at people with DiGiorgio syndrome, what you find is that, first of all, that almost all of them have learning disabilities. They've got facial disfigurements. They can't speak properly usually because of misalignment of the jaw. They also are extremely vulnerable to other physical ailments, particularly heart disease and so on. So imagine what it's like growing up like this. You're somebody with a learning disability, you look odd, you can't speak properly. What kind of world do you grow up in? What we know about people with learning disabilities is that something which very often happens to them is that they get very badly bullied. And we also know from other studies that bullying appears to be one factor which influences psychosis. What's going on here? It could be that the genes are playing a causal role, but it could be that the genes lead somebody to experience a particular type of environment, being bullied, which in itself then leads on to the illness. Yeah. Now, we don't actually know which of those two possibilities is true. And I should say there are even more complicated possibilities than either of those two. And the reason for that is because genetic researchers just haven't bothered to measure the environment. Now, you could actually criticize people like me, psychological researchers. You say, oh, you guys, you haven't measured genes either. And all I would say about that is we should. I want to. I've been trying to get money to do it for a very long time and nobody will give it me. The essential point is you can only understand how these things work if you measure both. You can't just look at heritability estimates and just say environment is what's left. It's not like that.
Because the way that genes and environment interact are very, very complicated.
Yeah. And I'll give you another example, a thought experiment this time about the heritability estimate, which will explain that maybe might indicate why the correlational issue is very important. You can actually have heritability of 100% of something which is largely determined by the environment. So if you imagine a world where everybody smokes exactly 20 cigarettes a day, nobody smokes 19, 18, 17, or 22, 23, they all smoke exactly 20. What would be the heritability of lung cancer in that environment? Would be pretty much close to 100%, because the only difference between those who smoke, who get lung cancer, and those who don't would be genes, because everybody gets the same environment.
But wouldn't there be in that example, other environmental differences that you'd have to account for?
I said almost 100%.
Okay,
thought experiment. But yeah, the point would be that.
Or I think there's an opposite example which might be useful and also make your point, which is like you could get 100 people who all have a genetic vulnerability to alcoholism, and you could put them on an island with no alcohol, and no one would become an alcoholic. The phenotype would never come out.
Yeah. So I think it's very important going forward to do research which combines genetics with environmental measures. It's just very difficult to convince, it seems, my experience, geneticists and the MRC and people like that, we should do that. But that's what I think we should do.
Yeah, when I've spoken to Catherine Lewis, who is a professor of statistics, actually, but in the genetics lab at the IOP, the Institute of Psychiatry at King's, she was advocating for this more multidisciplinary approach where psychologists, psychiatrists, geneticists can collaborate more to try and cross these disciplines.
That gets 100% of my endorsement. So that's why I think. And if we did that, the interesting thing is we would find out much more about the mechanistic pathways, because the mechanistic pathways are going to be important in terms of helping people. For example, I mentioned that I'd spent a lot of my time working on CBT for psychosis. Put an awful lot of effort into that. I've been involved in a lot of clinical trials. And I like to think it's probably done some good in the world because it has been taken on by NICE. But the reality is that although in the early days we told ourselves we were basing our CBT ideas on some kind of understanding of the psychology of symptoms. Mostly that wasn't really true. It was developed very pragmatically. And I think CBT, the evidence is it's not a panacea. It helps people. Some people it doesn't help at all. And one of the things is we need to know to be able to predict who it helps. But if we could understand these mechanisms, we would be in a much stronger place, because we might be able to find psychological interventions which actually work for particular types of mechanistic pathways. And actually, I'm in this late stage of my career working on that. We've just done with colleagues, we've just done a feasibility trial of EMDR for psychosis, which is a therapy which is not, some people count it as a form of CBT, but it's not really. It's quite different. But it's a therapy which targets the traumatic memories which people have when they've had trauma in their lives. And our idea is to see whether that would actually also help to change psychotic symptoms.
Yeah, that could be really interesting. So, I mean, I'd like to offer how I think about psychosis and schizophrenia, and you can tell me what you think about that. So I guess, and this really correlates with what I've seen clinically. So I've seen people a lot who come into A&E, for example, with psychosis. Some kind of emergency has happened. And what I see is that the following seem to go together a lot, and that would be erratic, chaotic, disorganized behavior, disorganized speech, thinking patterns, so like sentences which aren't coherent, which don't seem to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Hallucinations, so the sensation that you're either hearing a voice that doesn't seem to be coming from any person, or seeing something that other people don't see. And then delusional beliefs, which we could spend a 3-hour podcast trying to define, but
we could. I'm writing a book on it at the moment.
well, there you go.
Yeah.
But roughly delusional beliefs which are seemingly quite bizarre, quite rigidly held, that it's hard really to talk someone out of or reason with or entertain any kind of doubt around. And importantly, which seem to be out of keeping with that person's cultural context. And I see those, I have seen those go together quite a lot. And then what I see typically is either the person makes a kind of complete recovery that can be with medication, but it might be that if the person was, for example, using a drug like cocaine, amphetamines, cannabis, and that seems to have induced those symptoms, which we know it can. Sometimes it resolves spontaneously within a few days without needing to add any medication, just providing basically a safe environment. So that's what I think of as psychosis. And then what I think of as schizophrenia is if psychotic episodes keep happening recurrently, so those symptoms that I described, if they keep happening throughout life, sometimes they might happen several times and then resolve, sometimes with treatment, sometimes without. Sometimes what I've seen quite a lot in hospital is people who have those symptoms I mentioned kind of at a low level but chronically. So they might experience hallucinations chronically, unusual beliefs chronically, but also importantly the speech and the behavior, and perhaps a lack of self-care as well, I should add, what are called negative symptoms. And my basic beliefs around the causation are like perhaps a likely genetic vulnerability, but then trauma, life stress, other environmental influences like drugs. And perhaps if those stresses, traumas, the drugs weren't present, perhaps those symptoms might never show. So that's my thinking about the etiology and the presentation. And how does that align or not align with your thinking?
First of all, straight observation of people having psychiatric emergencies. That's, I think you're describing them pretty much as they often are. It's interesting. I'm thinking about your description, and you put a lot of emphasis on disorganization, and particularly disorganized speech. Now, I've actually done a few studies of disorganized speech, but hardly anybody else has. Weirdly, it was much studied by psychologists and linguists, actually, in the 1980s and 90s in the United States. And then I don't know why it just went out of fashion. But it is that feature of psychosis is one which is not particularly well understood. But one thing which we do know about it is it's highly linked to emotion. For example, I've done 2 or 3 studies where, and actually with both bipolar patients and schizophrenia patients, where we simply ask the patients who have a history of that type of disorganization, we ask them to talk about things. And in one condition, we ask them to talk about something banal, what they've seen on television. And the other one, we ask them to talk about something emotionally stimulating, such as what were the events which surrounded them going into hospital. And what happens is you just get the disorganized speech when they're talking about the emotional stuff. And other people found that as well. So we know that is quite linked to emotion. And there's some evidence that when you're emotionally charged up like that, it's very difficult to calibrate your speech to the needs of the listener. So in a typical conversation, you're unconscious, like we're having now, you're unconsciously monitoring whether you think the other person is understood. And that process is somehow disrupted when the person becomes emotionally aroused. Interesting thing is that it seems that if you find somebody who's disorganized like that, and it's incredibly difficult to listen to them. I've tried. What happens is you can pay attention for a very short period of time, but then after a while, your brain just drops out because it's so difficult to see what they're saying. But if you come back to them later when their symptoms have ameliorated a bit, and if you ask them what they were talking about, they can tell you. And it's usually emotionally distressing stuff. So what you're describing as that kind of crisis is actually, to some extent, an emotional crisis. And it usually is something like that, which leads to a acute psychotic episode. Now, in terms of saying if they keep having that, and if it persists, we call that schizophrenia. Fair enough, but that's just a convention, really. And what's not clear is that schizophrenia, as I mentioned before, is distinct from bipolar disorder. In fact, one of my PhD students just published a really neat study of that in Schizophrenia Bulletin, where we took data, managed to get data from previously conducted studies. We had over 1,000 patients' data, I think, and we show that in many ways, when you look at the structure of the symptoms for schizophrenia and bipolar patients, the underlying structure is actually the same. So they look different, but it's probably different presentations of the same thing, basically. And yeah, so have I answered your question?
I'm not sure I understood the last point, and I'd just like to, just before we go into that, I'll just inform the listener. So I explained a little bit about how psychosis is typically thought of. So when we're talking about bipolar, we're talking about, conventionally, we would describe individuals who have what's called manic episodes. That's the hallmark. And that would be episodes of weeks to more rarely months, where the person has very high levels of energy, fast, pressured speech. Their thoughts might be racing. They may then have psychotic symptoms on top of the mania, which I suppose is where it becomes diagnostically uncertain. But more typically in mania, the delusional thoughts, they would be congruent with that person's mood. So if they feel really elated, they might feel they're like a prophet. They might hear voices that correspond with that, for example, hearing the voice of God. But it's also important to point out that there are many cases of mania, and I've seen them, what we would call mania, that don't have psychosis. So the person is just really high in energy. They speak very quickly. They stop sleeping. They might sleep 2 to 4 hours a night, where normally they would sleep 8. Their appetite is vastly reduced. They may also engage in more risky behaviors than normal. That might be like sexual behaviors, gambling, spending money, things like that. So that's, and then aside from manic episodes, they might have episodes of depression, which people tend to understand what that is. So could you just explain to me, now that we know that last point, how are they more similar than we realize?
It's quite technical. So just as a bit of background, I mentioned already, but there are lots of reasons for thinking that these disorders are not entirely separate. And one clear reason for thinking that is because of schizoaffective patients. So schizoaffective patients are patients who have a mixture of both sets of symptoms.
And I'll say I've seen a lot of that.
Yeah, I would actually say it's probably more common than pure schizophrenia or pure bipolar. So there's a lot of debate about how to make sense of that. And I guess a good thing I would say is that when I first started writing this area and I wrote stuff which is skeptical about psychiatric diagnoses, my first paper on that was in the late 1980s, people thought I was nuts, I'm pretty sure. But I don't think they think I'm nuts now, because I think nearly everybody thinks the classification system is not really working. So the question then is, what do you do to fix it? And the answer to that is nobody knows, but there are plenty of ideas in town which are being explored. A lot of these ideas involve using big statistics, using quite powerful statistical tools to make sense of the idea is you find the actual pattern of symptoms. Try and find actual syndromes, that's groups of symptoms which go together.
So really what we would have wanted from the DSM in the first place, a true statistical manual.
Yeah. And one idea which has emerged out of that is that maybe all patients with psychosis, maybe all of them can be described in terms of 5 dimensions of symptoms. It's just that different patients have different profiles. So 5 dimensions are positive symptoms, negative symptoms, disorganization symptoms, depression, and mania. And the idea is that this is just a hypothesis, although there's quite a lot of evidence to support it, but I wouldn't say it's a kind of proven. So the idea is that all people with psychosis, whatever their diagnosis, they've just got different profiles within that kind of 5-dimensional space. And so they all belong to, there's some similarity, essentially, even though they look different. This is where it gets a bit technical, okay? So those ideas are based on something called a latent variable model. And what that means is this, that we think the symptoms are expressions of something hidden which we can't see, a disease process, right? Statistical terms, that's represented by a method which we call factor analysis, which is a technique which estimates what that thing might look like from the pattern of the symptoms. And those who support the 5-dimensional model, they basically say there are 5 latent factors. So you could say that psychosis has got 5 separate disease processes which appear to different degrees in different people. There is an alternative, however, which is to say that maybe there is no hidden process as such. Maybe what happens is you get patterns of symptoms because one symptom causes another, which causes another, and possibly in the kind of typical way. And that's called a network model. And there are very powerful statistical techniques which have only been around for about 10 years, which allow you to see whether the data you get from patients fit that model. Now, what you get is a fancy picture of a network, how the symptoms appear to be influencing each other. Now, I should say there are lots of caveats to this. Is it causal? We don't know. But basically, you can get these kind of patterns. And that's what we used looking at schizophrenia and bipolar patients. So what you're looking at is the interconnections between the symptoms, the extent to which what we're assuming is that each of the symptoms are influencing each other, and you can measure the influence. But it's an assumption that's what's happening. If you do that, it turns out that the pattern of influence is the same in bipolar disorders and in schizophrenia patients. So although the symptoms look very different on the surface, the interconnections between them are the same. And they're strikingly the same. That would also fit the idea that we've got one general psychosis which is expressed in different ways under different circumstances. I don't know if I believe that, by the way. I just think it's a tenable hypothesis. Actually, I'll go a little bit further. I'll stick my neck out and say what I think is likely to turn out to be true, but we don't know how to test it. So you've got these 2 different kind of ideas. One is that symptoms go together because they're caused by some underlying process, the disease. And the other is that symptoms go together because there's a characteristic way in which symptoms influence each other. We don't have a statistical test to tell the difference between the 2 of those. At the moment, we can do a network analysis of our patients' data and we get a nice picture. We could do a factor analysis and we get a nice picture, and they both look convincing, but there's no way of telling which one's really convincing. Reality, almost certainly, it's some hybrid of both. That there are some underlying processes which influence symptoms, but also the symptoms influence each other. And it's beyond our statistical ability at the moment to construct and test such models, but I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes possible in the future, because one of the big unsung stories of my career, not my career, my personal contribution, although I did make one small contribution in this area, is just the phenomenal advance in analytic methods which are available. So statistical techniques that we can use now are incredible compared to what I was taught when I was a student.
Yes, and with the onset of I imagine the ability to analyze large data sets is just going to improve exponentially from here.
Yeah, I know lots of people who think that, and I know lots of people who are dabbling in machine learning as a kind of as a technique. I think, let's see. It's not. I know some skeptics about it as well. The big argument about that, but one of the big problems with that is that you can set your AI to start analyzing stuff and it can give you an answer, but you don't know why it's got the answer. It'll come up with predicted models. At the moment, I've just been on a small toy project, tried with a colleague who's into that stuff. We tried to see where we could predict outcomes in a longitudinal data set of schizophrenia patients. That's ongoing at the moment. But what we'll probably end up with some combination of variables which look like, if you combine them in a particular way, predict a bad outcome. But then you go, why?
Yeah, it's always worrying when the AI does something and you have no idea why. I heard some anecdote once that some AI algorithms were designed to help run the stock market in China, and then one day they just decided to shut the market down, and they had no idea why that was
I've not heard
happening.
that, but I guess it's not implausible. I use AI in my work a little bit, but I find it's really helpful for some things, but I think you've got to treat it cautiously at the moment anyway.
Okay, so we've already dived deeper in terms of the possible causation of conditions like psychosis, bipolar disorder, but now moving on to, what to do. And I think one of the real revolutions of the past 10, 15, 20 years in treating patients with these conditions is actually saying there is value to understanding how you got to where you are, and there is psychological meaning to be made out of the symptoms that you have. So if, for example, you have a paranoid delusion, it may not make a lot of sense at face value. At face value, it may seem like you've lost contact with reality. But I think there's a lot, and there's a lot of what your work proposes is there's a lot of we can understand about a person through that. So I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about what might be some of the underlying psychological mechanisms underlying things like delusions or hallucinations.
Let's take delusions. Delusions I find endlessly fascinating, partly because of something you alluded to earlier, which is the difficulty of distinguishing them from extreme ideologies, for example. And that's why I'm trying to write a book about it, to try and solve that problem, because writing a book really makes you think about stuff. But basically, if you take, we've actually published a review of the world literature on this, which is, I say we, one of my students and I, which it turns out that across the world there are 5 major delusions which come up all the time. Paranoid delusions, reference delusions, grandiose delusions, delusions of control, and religious delusions. Now, it has to be said that there are a lot of very obscure kind of delusional syndromes which seem to really excite neuropsychologists, like misidentification syndromes and things like that, but Capgras syndrome. But putting those to one side, because they're very rare, it's these 5 main types. But if you think about them, they've all got some kind of meaning attached to them, because they are addressing one of the real existential dilemmas of life. One of the things we have to decide in our everyday lives just constantly is who to trust. And we know, for example, from studies that if you meet somebody who you've never met before, you meet somebody for the first time, you form an immediate impression about whether they're trustworthy within about 200 milliseconds. So it's faster than you can think. So something is going on pretty automatically. You're just picking up cues, automatically making that judgment. Of course, you can then adjust the judgment later. Yeah. But dividing the world into those who are trusted and those who are not is very important for survival. And paranoid patients seem to be doing it slightly differently. And we know that typically paranoid patients have had genuine victimization experiences. There's a nugget of truth in paranoia all the time. And actually, it's quite rational to be paranoid under some circumstances. So that's paranoia. Reference We all have to scan our environment all the time and decide which stimuli are relevant to us. But that's essential to survival. And looks like in reference delusions, that is somehow not going quite right.
What's happening when someone has a reference delusion? What do they typically report or describe?
I should say these are probably very little researched by psychologists, but a very common thing, for example, is people saying that the radio announcer or the TV presenter is actually addressing a message directly to them. So there's some significance in, they might think that the actual presenter is actually talking directly to them, or there's some secret message encoded in what they're saying. That will be a reference delusion. Next one is delusions of grandiosity. Again, what's in everyday life, all of us, human beings are a social species, and we naturally compare ourselves to other human beings, and we compare ourselves in a kind of social ranking. Whether that's a good thing or not, we do it pretty automatically. Interestingly enough, it turns out that being low social rank or thinking yourself as low social rank is a predictor of every type of psychiatric disorder there is. That's an important issue, and obviously it's going wrong in some way with grandiose patients. Delusions of control. Most of us have concerns about autonomy. How much are we in control of ourselves and our lives? And so you can see how that connects. And finally, religious delusions. What is the meaning of life? And what happens after I die? So although delusions come out in a kind of weird way, all of them all the main ones have got some link to core existential themes. And so far as we know, the only one which has been studied intensively is paranoid delusions. They seem to be related to life events as well. In a way, I suppose the important point is that psychosis is part of humanity in some sense. It's part of that sort of, that it's a kind of expression, a dysfunctional expression of all the things which people worry about in their lives.
Yeah, I suppose what you're saying is all of those different delusions reflect really fundamental needs and uncertainties we all have.
Yes.
The uncertainty about who to trust, the uncertainty about how relevant different things are, the uncertainty about how much we're worth, the uncertainty about what life is all about and its meaning. And I guess when people's needs go really, really unmet, traumatic experiences, this delusion can come up perhaps in consequence.
We know quite a bit about some of the psychological mechanisms involved, particularly in paranoia. That low self-esteem seems to be very important, but actually part of paranoia. If you feel low in social rank and you feel that you're very low self-esteem, then you also feel very vulnerable and open to persecution by others. And we also know, the interesting thing I think is that persecutory delusions are particularly related to attachment style as well. That's part of the same story, really. Probably most of your listeners know that the bonds we form with our caregivers when we're young provide a kind of template for how we handle relationships as we grow up. And in the case of paranoid patients tend to be what we call insecurely attached or anxiously attached, which is they tend to assume that they are not worthy and that nobody would really love them, basically, is what it boils down to. And this seems to be a kind of template which they've learned in life.
The thing that strikes me on discussing these topics and reflecting about my time, particularly in inpatient services, hospitals, less so in the community, but definitely in hospitals, is there was not much of an emphasis on trying to understand someone psychologically in a hospital. Certainly not trying to understand someone's unmet needs, and not a lot of emphasis on trying to create an environment which is non-threatening. It's complicated because a lot of times when people are in acute psychotic states or manic states, they can be dangerous. It can be an unpredictable environment. So there's this need for safety and risk aversion, and that's important. But at the same time, it felt like a lot could have been done to make an environment more positively nurturing, more comfortable, less threatening where possible. And I feel perhaps this is something we're really missing in our public mental health system.
I 100% in fact, 1,000% agree with you. Because actually, I'll tell you just a kind of interesting thing which came out of one research study I was involved in. I mentioned before that I'd made a small contribution to statistics. It wasn't really my contribution, but I was involved. I had a lot of data on the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the patient, what we call a therapeutic alliance, in one of our trials. And I got talking to a wonderful statistician called Graham Dunn about how to analyze the data. And I thought I knew how to analyze the data using simple regression techniques. And Graham was almost, I wouldn't say he was appalled. I expected him to say, yeah, go ahead and do that. But he didn't. He said, there's a fundamental problem in statistics here which has never been solved, which is not something you actually want to hear from a statistician. And amazingly, he then took 10 years to solve it. But basically, what he wanted to show was that the therapeutic alliance was causal in whether the therapy worked. And to do that, it was necessary to eliminate what we call confounding is third variables, which could confuse the picture. So, for example, suppose there was something which made you like the therapist, but also made you get better. It would then look as if the amount you like the therapist made you get better, but that wouldn't be true. It would just be a spurious correlation. I'd thought of that, of course. So I built my models so they had all sorts of control variables in, everything I could measure, basically. But as Graham said, there's always something you haven't measured. And maybe it's the color of the wallpaper in the room where the therapy was carried out would have influenced whether the patient felt good with the therapist and also whether they'd get better or not. Anyway, Graham developed or adapted, because they were first used in economics, a methodology called instrumental variable analysis, which actually allows, under some circumstances, and this is one of them, you could to show causation absolutely. And it turned out the therapeutic alliance was causal. We'd proven that the therapeutic alliance did make a big difference. It was the main feature of whether CBT worked.
And that's even in cases of psychosis, or just CBT generally for psychosis?
So it was just with psychosis. But a big trial, 300 odd patients. And interestingly enough, and this was a very important finding, just as important really, we found that people had a bad therapeutic alliance, CBT made them worse. So having a therapy from somebody you didn't have a good relationship with was damaging. But that got me thinking, which is because we'd put a lot of effort into the idea that CBT is a kind of technical, I often think it's a bit like a prescription pad for some psychologists. This is our technique.
It's manualized. You just follow the manual.
Yeah. To be fair, most psychologists don't quite think of it like that. They think it's that the manual guides you, but essentially it doesn't work unless you've got this high quality relationship. What about the relationship between the doctor, the prescriber, and the patient? What about the relationship between the nurses on the wards? I don't know if this is true, but I would actually bet a very considerable portion of my meager wealth on it, which is that if you could improve all of those, you would actually massively improve patients' outcomes. If you could make sure that every relationship in, say, inpatient wards was of the right sort, from the cleaning person up to the consultant, then you would get much better outcomes.
Have you ever heard of the Trieste model?
I have, yeah. I don't know that much about it. Weirdly enough, I was in Italy actually giving some lectures in Padova recently, which isn't that far from there. And I did wonder about going over back now.
The reason I bring it up, because it seems to be the best example to my mind of attempting this, of really having a model where the mental health system firstly was directly integrated with the social services. So this sort of much more fluid, but also it was person-centered really from the ground up, with patients given opportunities to participate in their local community a lot more readily and more easily. And really a de-emphasization on coercion, mandatory use of medication, use of the Italian equivalent of the Mental Health Act. And it would, by all appearances, they achieve very, very good results. And I had someone who really ran their system for a number of years, Dr. Roberto Mezzina, on the podcast a few months ago.
Oh, I should have seen that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can send it to you, but that seems to be the best instantiation of what you described is what if we had a mental health system where relationship really was put as a priority?
Do you know about soteria?
No.
Okay, so it's another thing which is a bit similar. So it was created by Lauren Mosher, who was an American psychiatrist who I knew just before he died. He was an extraordinary person, actually. So the story goes that Mosher was appointed to be head of schizophrenia research at NIMH in the United States. And just before he was about to take up the post, he was on holiday in London, and he'd heard about R.D. Laing and Philadelphia House and Lang's experiments with a kind of therapeutic community for psychosis. So he decided to visit. Now, Lang couldn't organize a piss up in a brewery. He was hopeless. And although he did actually spend quite a lot portion of his life actually pissed, apparently. So Mosher visits Lang's facility, and he was appalled because the place was in chaos. Nobody had decided who was going to cook the next meal, that sort of thing. But he thought, what if he did it properly? And he got a grant from NIMH to set up this one called Soteria House in Oakland, I think it was. And it was just a place where people with first episode psychosis could go, and they were cared for by people who were not mental health professionals, but were selected purely for their interpersonal skills. And they were more or less told, just be kind. And they kept medication to an absolute minimum. And it had very good results, again. But it didn't please Mosher's masters at NIMH, and he eventually had to leave his position as chief of schizophrenia research. There was big arguments over it. Robert Whittaker, the American journalist, has written quite a lot about it. And as I say, I talked to Mosher a bit about it himself before he died. But there are different versions of exactly why he ended up parting ways with NIMH, as you can imagine, depending on which side you're on. But it sounds like a very similar thing, that it was just providing a very kind, supportive, but structured, with some rules, environment where people felt safe.
And it strikes me that, we can, there's two worlds, and we could get lost in both worlds. And one world is what's causing these problems, whether it's depression, psychosis, mania. And as our listeners will be aware, if they've listened to this whole conversation, it's really complicated and very mysterious still. And then there's this other world of like, given that people have these problems, what is the best way to interact with them? What is the best way to treat them? What is the best way to contain and help them make progress in different ways? And often we can get so lost in the first world and maybe get bought into certain ideas or small silos of it that we lose some of the more common sense paths forward.
I'd agree with that. But the other thing I'd like to say about that is that if you have a kind of I've in recent years begun to think of myself more as a social scientist than a biomedical scientist. But if you're thinking you're applying the tools of social science to understand these strange behaviors, and if you apply them properly, the picture which you get is actually quite a humane one.
Right.
I think it was Wittgenstein said something like the best picture of human nature as a human being, which is the sort of it turns out that if you do the research, trauma, life experiences, bad stuff which happens to people, this is all very important. And in terms of a causal factor. And it also turns out that if you're working clinically with people, actually want to talk about those things, and they really like to have their stories taken seriously, and that's hugely therapeutic for them. You don't have to be a kind of genius psychotherapist to actually just treat the patient as a human being and just say, tell me what happened. What's the story which got you to that position? Just providing the opportunity for them to tell that story is actually very helpful for people. But also it provides a lot of information to a clinician. And as I say, one of the weird things is that what you find when you do that is often you can relate it to psychological models we have for how these symptoms develop.
Absolutely. And it just reminds me of what I've learned in psychotherapy training, which is that like 80% of the effectiveness is just the basic skills of listening, empathy, mirroring, clarifying, just being a good listener gets you most of the way there. And then there's some really clever ideas that you can put on top of that sometimes, and that can work or not work. But there's a foundation that's...
Late in my day, I became a fan of Carl Rogers,
Yes.
the American psychologist who wrote a lot about that essential. Rogers was a huge optimist, and he thought that you could actually, the task of the therapist, people could cure themselves, and if you provided the right circumstances. And he thought that the task of the therapist was just to provide the right circumstance. I don't agree. I think that's going too far. But he pointed out there are some essential listening skills, some essential therapeutic skills. You have to empathize with the patient. You have to be genuine with the patient. You have to show them positive regard and look for which means looking for the best in them. And if you can do those things, then you're well on your way to being a good therapist. But what's underappreciated is how difficult that is. I was once asked by a journalist, if I had a superpower, what would it be? And I said, being able to show empathy, genuineness, and unconditional positive regard on a Friday afternoon is a superpower, which is my glib answer. Because it is in a way. You're tired, you've been doing clinical work all week, or in my case, you've been up to your eyes and trying to help PhD students and lecturing and grant writing, stuff like that. And then you're in this room with this person. It's Friday afternoon, you're exhausted, it's probably not the best time for them. It's so easy for your brain to suddenly start thinking about the shopping list. Actually directing your attention and giving your attention to people in a way which is helpful is not easy.
Yes, and I think Rogerian philosophy actually runs pretty deep, and a lot of why it takes so much discipline to do that kind of therapy is not just what you mentioned, but also the emphasis on being non-directive, of listening and not reflexively telling a person what to do or giving them advice or giving them a prescription.
Yeah.
It takes an enormous amount of discipline. And if you don't think it does, I suggest try doing that with your partner for a month. Try not telling your partner what to do for a month, and email me and let me know how you get on with that.
Okay, so yeah, no, I think it is hard to do that, and as I say, it's a real skill to be able to do it, and some people are not suited to it.
Yeah, and perhaps if there's one takeaway, it's that, how can we devise a way where more people working in mental health settings, particularly the acute settings, have these skills, and it can be more deeply embedded in the ethos of the organization somehow.
Yeah.
Big question, maybe, perhaps for another podcast.
Yeah, that would be a big task, but if you could do it, it would make a huge difference.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for coming on today. We're out of time, but it's been wonderful to speak to you. I look forward very much to your book about delusions. Let me know when it's out, and perhaps you can come back on and we can talk about it. And thank you very much for spending some time with me today.
No, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for your interest. And yeah, okay, it's been very nice to meet you.